Okay. Alrighty. Seems like I'm now officially on time. Let's see. Let's see how this goes. So I'm letting everyone, I see that there's 3 on. So I'm just going to quickly type in hello. If you guys can also say hello to me, that would be great. Hak Purim Sameach, Danielle. Thank you. Rather exciting, isn't it? For the life of me, I can't get anything to... There we go. Just trying to see how this all works. Can you guys hear me? Can you hear me? Hey Donna, how are you? Okay, so far I see 4 have logged on. I'm going to do a 1 more minute wait. See if anybody else can hear me, or can you hear me clearly? Good, good. So it doesn't sound like there's a big echo or anything? All right, so I'm going to wait until 8:03 my time, so 3 minutes past the hour, and then I'm going to start the class. Hopefully the Mevo here is not going to you know, do anything funky like it did last week. If I could ask you, Donna, if you could just post the link to this YouTube post to our little group site at Coalhesed, I'd really appreciate it. Because I'm all wired up and I can't even do anything beyond what I've just set up. I'm going to make one adjustment. No, that's not what I want. I want... Let's see what this looks like. Okay. Of course. Gotta stop messing around with the system. All right. Let me just do this real quick. Let me see if I can pull this off, causing major grief here. Come on. Okay, really fast. Sorry, gang. Lost one. Maybe process. Okay. Into the group, and just want to do it into the, and then we will start. I'm just looking. Come on so far. Just go in here. Sorry, gang. Okay. Just want to quickly just say we are live on the big group here. Is going to go. This is great. Okay. All right. So now we're cooking with gas. I will switch to this, and we are good. All right, gang. So let's begin. So tonight, tonight we're going to discuss. Hey, how are you, CVV 1962? So tonight, we're going to go over a critical step within Judaism, and particularly the concept of language and how it's changed. So a couple of things I want to say is buckle your seatbelts, and the other thing is I'm going to say is there's going to be a lot of questions, I have a feeling, at the end of this. There's no such thing as a stupid question. The only stupid question there is, as my drill instructor used to say, is the one you do not ask. And don't forget that those who, oh hey Clint, those who, the question that you may ask is maybe a question other people want to ask, but either are afraid to ask or may not have thought of that question. So I'm going to leave it at that. So tonight we're going to go through what happens after the return of the Persians and under King Cyrus. Jews are already back in Judea. That's why they're called Jews now, as opposed to Bnei Israel, which is kind of interchangeable at this point. King Cyrus and the Persian Empire moved people into their respective countries. There's a level of freedom of religion. There is a taxation system that's in place, tributary or tributes that, okay. Can you hear me now? You guys have any difficulty hearing me now? Because I'm seeing bars as I'm speaking. Okay. I'm going to continue unless I get another message. So here we go. So after the Romans have a tribute system, but we're going to get into that. But at this present time, the Persians have a system in which their taxes paid to the Persian Empire, and in return for that, each state, meaning like a city-state, like the state of Israel, well, Judea, and other countries, were allowed to be sovereign. Are you getting static and on off? Okay. Thank you. I'm hopefully the speaker is, like, I've got my headphones in, so I'm hoping that this is So what we're having right now is a circumstance where the Persian Empire has established a system where people are sovereign within their state, meaning they're a small country, they have freedom of religion, and at the same time have a level of sovereignty even though they're paying taxes or tributes to the empire which is protecting them, thereby that being the Persian Empire. So I'm going to begin tonight's discussion with a story. You know, what rabbi would not start anything without telling a story. So in my house, we have an old Victrola. My grandparents got it back in 1907. And it's one of those wind-up ones with the, they were considered a deluxe model. It had a microphone internally, a speaker internal, and the volume was set by opening and closing doors. So my nephew, this was back in 1998, my nephew at the time was 16 years old. He was born in 1986. And he came into the house and he said, "Hey, what's that?" And I said, "Oh, that's a Victrola." And I put a record on and wind it up and play it. And he stood there in amazement. He says, "It's not." And he said, "Wow, I've never seen CDs that big." So why am I telling you this story? Well, because the story is this. We assume a certain mentality, a certain attitude, a certain technology, and in reality, that is not necessarily the case. So tonight, we're going to begin with what happens after the Persian Empire collapses. And what I'm going to tell you about is completely historically as accurate as I can share it with you tonight. And more importantly, it's going to set a precedent for you, I'm hoping at the end of the discussion, or the end of this lecture, it's going to actually open your eyes to certain aspects of what's going on and how things have changed over time. So after the Persian Empire starts to collapse, what happens is Alexander the Great. The Greek idea of Hellenism, and for those of you who don't know this, up until this point in history, particularly for the Jews, particularly for Israel, even under the Babylonian captivity, Babylonians were not they had no concept of assimilation as we understand it today. That's why Jews as a whole were able to sustain themselves for the 70 years that existed, and they were able to, withstand the onslaught of a different culture while in captivity. What happens after that is something completely new, never seen before, and had changed the way the world views itself ever since. Under Alexander the Great, Alexander went through and by the age of 24, 25, taken over all of the known world at the time, all of what was part of the Fertile Crescent, all the way into Afghanistan, and then died. But not before assimilating folks and Greekifying, or what we now know as Hellenizing the world. And how that worked was this. He would come into a foreign country and start to say, well, we have concepts like this, and start to share ideas within that culture. And by doing so, and forcing them to read and speak Greek, and to expose them to philosophy and other aspects, including language, he was able to link onto that culture and make it part of the Greek Empire. And this aspect of including and taking hold of or taking on with the culture that the Greeks encountered, and in some ways making it Greek, and thereby making it Greek, absorb it into the greater culture of the Greek mindset, is something that is unique to Hellenism. In fact, it's so unique that some 2,500 years later, we're still doing it. So what happens is, after Alexander dies, and we're not sure from what, some people say an appendicitis, some people say a virus, some people say an infected wound, we're not sure. But anyway, once he dies, there are 4 generals that take over all the known countries, one of them being the Ptolemy, which gets us to the Seleucian Empire, the Greek empire of Alexandria, Egypt, where its center was, and all the way as far north and east as Turkey, and as far south and west as to what is now Rome, or Italy, or we now know as Italy. So that empire is a substantially large empire. So what happens is that under the Seleucian Empire, those people, it's an interesting thing what happens. Greek dualism, which I'm going to just touch on, but I would encourage you to read about it. Greek philosophical dualism, which believes that there are 2. The first is one of the physical. And in Greek thought process, the physical is a shadow of what is more true in Greek mindset, which is the universal. So you have the universality of manness. I'm going to just use that example of manness, and that example becomes man, the physical form. It is a lesser perfect idea of whatever manness is, and I'm being very general because we have a lot to cover. But ultimately, there is a definite separation between the concept and its reality. And in dualism, we have an idea that as a physical item, we want to reach up to its perfection, which is found in its universal. So what we have is the beginnings of this Greek dualistic Western idea butting up against Eastern Judaism. Now, up until this point in time, this includes the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians, up into the Greeks. Judaism, or I should say Judean practice, Jews were a very small, insignificant in size nation with an obscure practice and observance. The whole world believed in a multitude of gods, a polytheistic idea of multitudes of gods, and this one religion, this one little nation, so small that it could barely fit into most other nations that, up until the point of the Greeks, could fit into any of the middle-sized nations that they had conquered, has this unique little practice with their unique little philosophy, and I'm using their terms here, their little philosophy of a god that has no face or name and is more powerful and cannot be observed, as opposed to the panoply or the pantheon of gods that exist all around at that time. So what occurs during this period of time is, during the Seleucian Empire, the king, or the general who becomes king of the Alexandrian practice, tries to slowly enforce assimilation into this little nation of Judea. So what transpires first is a soft assimilation. And that soft assimilation, oh, I'm sorry, it's a little hot. Let me just try to turn this down a little bit. There we go. Oops. let me just do this really quick. So there's no echo. So what happens next is there's a soft assimilation, and that soft assimilation is one of a philosophical nature. That being that the ideas of Jews in diaspora start to link with the ideas of Greek dualism. And what occurs out of that is what we refer to as Hellenistic Judaism or Alexandrian Judaism. And the reason why it's called Alexandrian Judaism is because its center, where it was first created, was in Alexandria. The Hellenist put into motion what we now know as the Septuagint, or the 70 translations from the Hebrew of the Torah into the Koine Greek, or the Common Greek. Now, that by itself starts to cause a lot of angst amongst Judeans around the 100s, the first to the last of the first century of the Common Era, before the Common Era. Because what happens is, once that translation from the Hebrew to the Greek happens, the Jews in diaspora start to apply the philosophical aspects of Greek dualism into the face of Jewish practice, pre-Judean practice, or because we don't have rabbinical Judaism. This Judaism concept is a fairly new one. So what happens is, what happens secondly is that those diasporian those Jews in diaspora start to do things like shave their beards, start to think about circumcision not so much as a physical Brit Milah, an actual circumcision, but one that's a spiritual circumcision. And you see where this is going. So the next movement for the Seleucid Empire is a hard assimilation. Now, when I was about Teshuvah, the first thing I wanted to do was, during Hanukkah, I was trying to find the Book of Maccabees in the synagogue. I was in yeshiva, was trying to find it. So you drop your mic down to a lower volume again. Let me try to see if I can do this without knocking myself out here. Okay, and now just bring this, and there we go. How's that? I'll figure this out by the time the fourth class comes in. So what happens is a hard assimilation, and that hard assimilation brings about what we now know as the Maccabean Revolt. So when I was searching all over for the Book of Maccabees, all through the shul, everybody said, no, we don't have the Book of Maccabees. It's not here. We just have, this guy say, no Megillah, no, because tonight is Purim. We know where the Megillah of Purim is. It's in the Book of Esther. And I said, well, where's the Hanukkah one? Well, we don't have that. And there's a reason for that. There are, depending on who you speak to, 7 books of the Maccabees. Of those 7 books, 2 are considered canon by the Roman Catholics, the first book of Maccabees and the second book of Maccabees. This is the Jerusalem, is a section of the Jerusalem Catholic Bible, and this is the apocryphal section. And I'm going to read you a portion from the book of Maccabees, first book of Maccabees, first chapter, verses 11 through 13. And it is as follows, starting with verse 11. And at the time there emerged in Israel a group of renegade Jews who inveigled many by saying, "We should go and make an agreement with the Gentiles round about. Nothing but disaster has been our lot since the cutting of ourselves off from them." This proposal was widely approved, and some of the people in their enthusiasm went to the king and received authority to introduce pagan laws and customs. And it goes on talking about the building of the gymnasium and exercising in the nude and embarrassing traditional Jews from practicing Judaism because when you exercised in the nude, people saw your circumcision. The Greeks and the Greek ideal of such manipulation or mutilation was considered an anathema to the perfect body. Cutting off anything from the physical lowered that physical item further away from the universal. So even in the first book of Maccabees, which is the more historical of the two, the second book of Maccabees talks about the miracle of the 8 days of the candles of the menorah being lit for 8 days with one oil. Now comes the discussion that I was saying earlier about showing my nephew a Victrola, and he assumed it was a CD player. Now, even though there are mentions in the Christian scriptures, some of the writings in the Talmud about celebrating Hanukkah as a Jewish holiday, that really didn't occur until about the 18th into the 19th century. And the reason was because once Jews, particularly in Germany and in England during the European period, the gift giving of Christmas occurred, and so to counteract the desire to convert to Christianity or start to practice what the Christians were doing, they resurrected the story, the Hanukkah story, as their own. So the concept of Hanukkah as a celebration of the Jews is one that's relatively new in its present iteration. So what happens? The first book of Maccabees goes into great detail about that really what caused this insurrection, this revolt, this Maccabean action, was that Greek Jews, Hellenistic Jews, felt that, hey, and I'm just paraphrasing from these verses, every time we fought those people trying to assimilate us, we've always gotten our butts kicked. Obviously, we're doing something wrong because we keep getting rolled over by, everybody, and now we're on to the Greeks. And the Greeks seem to be pretty enthusiastic about us practicing. We just need to, follow their ideals of what is considered spiritual. And so who really starts the Maccabean revolt are Jews who are Hellenistic versus the traditional, or what we're going to start to call the traditionalist Jews in Judea, who are observant, who are looking at the law and using it like is in jurisprudence, and it gets applied to everyone equally, regardless of station. So the Maccabean revolt happens because for the most part, the Hellenistic Jews say, hey, look, we need to start to adapt our belief system to make it more spiritual, not physical, because obviously we must be getting it wrong because the Greeks are so enlightened. We need to start applying our Judaism to their understanding of it. And here you have the very first example of Reform Judaism. Not Reform Judaism in an American sense, but a reform of Judaism from the Eastern understanding of following the mitzvot by the letter of the law and versus applying it to this modern Western ideal of dualism. So Now there's a couple of things that occur historically that we still practice because of the Maccabean revolt. Once the Seleucians, as the Maccabean story goes, the Hanukkah story goes, start to enforce this idea by force, because they figured that these Hellenistic Jews will come in and try to convince these more traditionalist Jews to start following their idea, their Greek idea of Judaism, to the point where the Seleucid Empire starts to enforce laws like not reading the Torah and not circumcising your children. It's considered a death penalty. And how we as Jews get around it is on Shabbat, instead of reading from the Torah, we start reading from the prophets. And that's how the Haftorah reading starts. For that time, no one ever read the Haftorah. The Haftorah didn't exist in any form or shape until we get to the Maccabean period. Idea of the dreidel and all this other stuff, trying to teach Hebrew without forcing, because the same Koine Hellenistic Jews were like, they don't need to read Hebrew. They can read the Septuagint in the Koine Greek just like everybody, like we do. And there's a definite demarcation between those who live in Judea versus those who live outside in diaspora. And if this sounds equally familiar to you, this is the reasons why people in Orthodox communities inside Eretz Israel drop a wry eye to those who live outside Eretz Israel, because it goes back to this point. Those farther away from Jerusalem lose that perspective and become Alexandrian in their practice. So the Maccabean revolt occurs in the face of this. So the other thing that no one tells you during your Hanukkah visits and spinning dreidels and eating chocolate gelt at the synagogue is that what happens is eventually, and of course I'm shooting through everything to get to the Hasmonean Empire, the Hasmonean dynasty, is that we do finally rout the Greeks out of Judea. How we do that is that Matthias Maccabee makes a deal with this new up-and-coming republic that promises to allow them to have their freedom, like they did under King Cyrus of Persia, and still be under their protectorate. This young nation is called Rome. We brought in the Romans to keep out the Greeks. And what happens over time is we get a reflection of the Greeks back into the Romans. Why? Because the Romans want to be the Greeks. They've taken on their gods, they've taken on their writings, their practices are similar. So by the time we get to the Hasmonean dynasty, we've traded one taskmaster for another. And at the same time, we don't lose Hellenistic Jews. In fact, concepts that we find later on in Judaism is thanks to that interaction. The concept of a spiritual, a higher calling beyond the borders of Judea is from the Greeks. The concept of eternal heaven, a place which later becomes in the Jewish mindset the bosom of Abraham, and the concept of hell, Hades, which the writers of Josephus explains that the Greeks, when they first came in, tried to explain the concept of hell in their religion, and they said, well, and the Jews had no concept of an eternal damnation. And they pointed over to the garbage area, the place where we burned our garbage in Gehenna, and said, see, it smells, see, it's hot, see, the fires never stop, that's hell. And suddenly that becomes part of our language, and becomes part of, in a small way, it becomes part of our belief system, our worldview. So we get to this whole concept of the Hasmonean dynasty. And now that we have the Romans haven't allowed the Greeks to leave. Quite the opposite. They've taken over the Alexandrian and Ptolemy became a part of its protectorate, and in response to it, the Seleucid Empire, the Ptolemaic Empire, is still taking care of business, collecting taxes and administering justice on behalf of the Romans until we get to, I think, Octavian. Up until the time of Julius Caesar and so forth, we still have that situation. So the Hellenists are now really affecting what the rationale is. So we have two distinct groups of people. We have the Alexandrian Jews, the Hellenists, the Hellenist Judaism, and we have traditionalist Judaism. And traditionalist Judaism is Pharisaical Judaism. Because what happens is after the Hasmonean dynasty, first the Maccabees were backed by the Pharisaical groups. And then they switched groups and started backing the Sadducees. Now I want to add one extra thing to this discussion before we get even further. The Maccabees were Kohanim. They were Kohanim and they were rulers. So this concept of king and priest, even though it was a temporary fix, becomes part of the messianic understanding from that experience. Because of the Hanukkah story, we get both the concept of what later is understood as the Melchizedek idea in Christianity, the king and priest concept in Christianity, the idea that there's groups, but one group, one person, one king, which is completely counter to the way we have it set up, biblically speaking. So what we next have to discuss, once the Hasmonean dynasty, the Ptolemaic groups allowing Herod Agrippa and those folks to be king, and the Sadducees running the temple. So what happens is when that occurs, and the reason why I'm giving you all this background is because you have to see the entire Mishigas to understand where the language is changing. So the Sadducees are seen as sellouts first from the Greek. Basically they betray the traditionalist for the sake of their own ideas, and their ideas are to placate to whoever's in power. So the Pharisees break off into two groups. One is the Pharisaical groups that are in the streets, and the idea of going to the temple is necessary because Hashem says so, and at the same time, there's nothing you can find of truth and valor from that in regarding of the mitzvos. So now you can go. Now you're going to go to the house of the person who's the elder in your community, and these shuls are formed called synagogues. Synagogue is a Greek word for school, so it is a place where you went to study the law, the Torah. So that's the one group, the Pharisaical group, that creates the proto-rabbinical idea of, you go to the temple because you have to, because Hashem requires us to do so, but true study, true moral practice is the focus of the studying of the Torah and before the Talmud and the Haftorah, and listening to the oral traditions from the teachers directly, the rabbis. The other group is a much more radical group, and they go off into the Dead Sea area, and those guys are the Essenes. They are Pharisaical, but they think that even interacting with the town with the temple in its present circumstance, they believe that it's an abomination of desolation, that it never really, that as long as these guys are getting paid by a pagan nation, that they'll truly never be, it's truly not clean. So they live off and become vegan, and they can't eat any meat because there's no place to get kosher food, because the temple is considered to them unclean, and they go off into their extreme. And between those two groups, you've got a new group of people who feel that that we need another Maccabean revolt, but this time it's going to be a political action that we're going to overcome, and a terrorist group basically starts called the Zachari, right? The Zealots. And those guys keep flicking back and forth between the Essenes and the Pharisaical group. So let's talk about the two big thinkers. We'll first discuss the Hellenistic Jewish thinker, then we're going to talk about the traditionalist Jewish thinker, and then we're going to discuss the writers of early Christian writings and see what happens and where we're at. So first we're going to discuss Philo. Philo was born between 25 before the Common Era and dies right around Caligula's time, and that's around 50 of the Common Era, so 20 years before the destruction of the temple. He is a Hellenistic Jew. Some show him with a beard. Some later icons of the early Syrian and Coptic Christian groups show him without a beard, but with tassels in the back. We have a number of those examples. You just have to Google them. For the most part, he was part of the group that was part of the Septuagint transfer between the translating of the Hebrew of the Torah into what we now know is the Septuagint Greek. And there is a question historically of how much Hebrew he knew. He's at least 1.5 generations in from the Hellenistic movement that started with the Maccabean story that I just showed you, or just read to you. But he sets in motion, or at least what we have left over in the written knowledge that exists after the fire of the concept of what Greek Hellenistic Judaism looked like. He coins the phrase logos in reference to God's word. Logo in Latin or in Greek, well, in Latin particularly, means word, a word like W-O-R-D, but transfers it to the meaning that the word of God, meaning the word of God coming from God's mouth. Let there be light is ergo a logos, as they say. Therefore, it is the word that creates all things. And if that sounds familiar to you, there's a whole mess of other things that Philo teaches that places very quickly into the hands of the early writers of Christianity. The concept of being aware and tension in regard to kosher versus unkosher foods. In other words, food from idols. And just to give you a clarification, all food that in the known world, in the Greek and Roman world, was wine, bread, wine grain oil, and meat were sacrificed to animals, sacrificed to their gods. So all meat was considered meat from idols. His intention was, if it bothers you, then obviously it's a sin. If it doesn't bother you, then it's not a sin. And you know where I'm going with this if you haven't been paying attention. The other concept is that of being grafted on. That one of the things that you have to understand is that the Greek worldview, and later on, more importantly, the Roman worldview, was that they loved exotic things and inculcating them into their way of life. It's kind of like how people see yoga today in America or in the Western world. People all go to yoga classes thinking that it's, um, you know, how do I say this? Yoga classes are something for your physical health, but if you study yoga as a religious practice of the Hindu people, it's quite involved. So the thing about the Greeks and later on the Romans was one of the things that fascinated them about Judaism was the idea of a moral code, the idea that everyone was equal to everyone else because we were all created from one person, Adam, in example, and they liked the idea of a day off. They loved that idea. So, barring the fact of all the other things that get in the way, such as eating kosher, circumcision, those things, not their ball of wax, not their thing to do. But these other things, these concepts, once you remove the kosher and the circumcision portion of this, the core of it is very appealing to first the Greeks and then the Romans. And this is something that later on is how's the best way to say it, is used to its full effect when we get to Paul of Tarsus. So much of Philo's position is a spiritualization of mitzvos, of the commandments. That if it bothers you, don't do it. But ultimately, if you're thinking about it in the universal sense, and you're spiritually about it, you can be not Jewish. There is, he actually coins the famous phrase, there is no Jew, there is no Greek, there is no male, there is no female. There is the Logos. And sounds incredibly familiar for those of you who have ever spoken or read the Christian scriptures. So that's Philo in a nutshell. And surprisingly, when I was looking through Jewish Encyclopedia Online, which was very helpful, actually Wikipedia does a wonderful job on this. It was a great write-up. Most of the stuff is found in the Jewish Encyclopedia Online as well as in a few other books. But it's very interesting. So this is Philo. So let's talk about Gamaliel. Now Gamaliel is the grandson of both Hillel and Shammai. He's born around the same time. He is around 18 before the Common Era. Philo was born around 25 before the Common Era, so he's a little bit younger. Dies around 52 of the Common Era, so around the same period of time. So he's in his 70s when he passes away. Gamaliel is when it comes to the two houses, and if you want to go over Hillel and Shammai, I would suggest that you watch some videos that I did a couple of years ago about early proto-rabbinical Judaism and the rise of Pauline Christianity. I go into great detail about Shammai and Hillel. But anyway, in brief, Hillel is the more liberal person, Shammai is the more strict, and Gamaliel is both, his grandparents are both Hillel and Shammai. And one of the great things about Gamaliel is he is a great, when it comes to his two grandparents, he's always the one who is the compromiser in that regard. He's a traditionalist in the truest sense. In the example, the reason why when we put mezuzahs on like this, on a diagonal, the reason for that is because Hillel says you should do it this way, Shammai says you should do it this way, so Gamaliel says do it this way, and then you'll recognize, and then you'll be observing both my grandfather's ways of operating. But when it came to observing mitzvot, he combined the two concepts to its most strictest position. In the case of circumcision or in conversion to Judaism. Hillel said you should be immersed, mikved. Shammai says you must be circumcised. Gamaliel said, no, you got to do both. So there's a lot of aspects of Gamaliel that it brings about. Now, what is interesting to note is that Gamaliel is mentioned in the Christian scriptures, and it is questionable, to say the least. He's mentioned in the book of Acts, chapter 5, 34, verses 34 through 40. And within those verses also, his position on causing harm or pain is pretty accurate. The belief that committing a crime and committing even if you have witnesses, he would hold off on it. In fact, Rashi repeats this years later, in the sense that it's better to give somebody a long prison sentence than to take their life and discover that they are innocent. And then the blood is on not only the hands of the judge, but onto the whole community. So in that respect, the story in Acts chapter 5 is accurate. Where it's not accurate is when we get to the discussion in regards to Paul. Paul says a lot of things. Paul says that in the same book of Acts, in Acts chapter 22, verse 3, he said that he studied under him at his feet. Even though he was in Tarsus, one of the biggest strongholds of Hellenistic Judaism. And this is the part where I would argue, and I argue vehemently, that Paul is not even close to being anywhere near Gamaliel by his actions, by his statements, and by his determinations about how to observe in the early versions of this religion that becomes Christianity. So what happens is, and I'm going to make a caveat here because I don't want to get into this discussion about Jesus, only because it's going to muddy the waters. Let's be honest here. Paul never met Jesus, doesn't know who he is, doesn't even know what he looks like, doesn't know what he believes. And there's also a discussion of whether Jesus was a culmination of a number of people that are found both in the Talmud and in the Mishnah as a whole, and we won't go into that. But what is very important is what transpires within early Christianity. Amongst the Christian groups, you have two. One group are living in Judea, in Jerusalem, and so forth. They're very traditionalist. In fact, when we look at discussions about observing and being observant and getting ready to transition to observance to Judaism, Acts chapter 15 verses 20 goes very strict. Keeps people to a bare minimum of what they're supposed to observe. Now, I'm not saying that early Christianity was Jewish. What I am saying is that there were Jews in the movement, and they had a definite idea, a very traditionalist idea, of how to observe and how to be part of this movement. The other group was those of Paul. And you can name off those guys very quickly. Paul himself, primarily. Most likely Luke. The book of Acts is also Luke's writings. And then you have those guys who are very traditionalist. James, Jude, and for the most part, probably Jesus in his writings, if you're looking into the Didache. Like I said, don't want to go down that road. But what I want to say is that much of what Philo teaches, much of what Hellenistic Judaism was purporting from diaspora, from the diaspora, gets inculcated and absorbed into the movement that becomes Christianity. We can see this because you can literally subdivide the Christian scriptures, particularly the letters in the book, in the Christian scriptures, in their testament, between traditionalist writings and Hellenistic writings. And I'm just going to give a few examples. I'll leave it to you to go into a deeper view. Discussions in regard to circumcision. The traditionalist position is obviously Acts 15, Acts 22. The Hellenistic position, Romans chapter 2, verse 29, Galatians chapter 2, verse 12, Galatians chapter 5, verse 6, Colossians chapter 2, verse 11. The discussion about grace versus works. The Hellenistic position, obviously Galatians chapter 3, verses 1 through 10. The traditionalist position, people, whenever they're studying this for a historical effect, if you ever want to see what's going on in real time as best you can, if you want to go back in time and see what's going on in the first century of the Common Era, take two Christian Bibles, put Galatians chapter 3 on one side, and put all of the book of Galatians on one side, put the book of James on the other side, and read them side by side. They're arguing with each other. In fact, the book of Jude, which nobody ever reads in the Christian scriptures, I don't think I've ever seen anybody any Christian who's ever had a conversation with me, has ever read the book of Jude. The book of Jude is a warning to the traditionalist Christians that what's happening is that the Hellenists are inculcating their way of practice in. And who wins in this discussion when it comes to Christianity is obviously the Greek Hellenist position. Why? Because modern Christianity, or pre-Pauline Christianity, these writings that we see, and the writings that are canonized amongst the Christian scriptures are only a smattering of what was probably hundreds of thousands of volumes of books, letters, of different sorts of writings that have been destroyed for political gain, that being the Nicene, the Council of Nicaea 425. But one of the reasons why Paul, unbeknownst to Paul, why Paul's ideas and Hellenistic Judaism takes full hold and becomes Christianity is because there are way more Western Romans and Greeks than there are Jews. Because once you strip down all the difficult stuff for the average person to do and leave the easy stuff for the dabbler, what you have is what started back in 136 of before the Common Era with the book of Maccabees in the first book. Let's build gymnasiums and start to tell the Jews that we can practice Judaism with a Greek bent, a Greek worldview. And that spiritualism, and I'm hitting that in big quotes, is something that we wrestle with as Jews for almost 2,000 years. In fact, next week when we discuss false messiahs during the modern era, when we get to guys like Sabbatai Zvi, there's a full revolt against this spiritualism, to the point where we go back to a much more traditionalist practice outside the land of Israel, in diaspora. And that stays the way it does until almost the 18th century when we get the Baal Shem Tov. And one of the things that shifts is that we forget the origins of the words that we've used as Jews in Hebrew. And it gets translated into the Greek from words like emuna to faith, where emuna means merit, something you have to work for, to a word in the Greek for faith, which means something that you get as a gift. It changes the shift of how Judaism was intended 3,500 years ago when Moshe Rabbeinu was at the top of Mount Sinai. And we suddenly start to forget the inculcation of Western idealism, Western dualism, and it starts to penetrate and bleed through what we have. And what happens after the destruction of the temple, up into that point where we get to Sabbatai Zvi, because what happens is Rabbi Akiva, in 132 of the Common Era, takes hold of that messianic fervor and says to Christians, hey, you're waiting for your Messiah to come back? Here's Bar Kokhba. And then they rout Hadrian. Judaism. And because of our buying into this idea of Messiah, priest, king, savior, we spend the next 1763 years trying to get our footing back. So this is the part where I finish my lecture. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask. I am looking at the message board with my old 50-year-old eyes. Please, if you have any questions, please ask. If you want to be anonymous, just say, please let me be anonymous, don't mention my name, and I'll happily discuss anything you'd like. And I'm just babbling right now because I know that somebody who's watching this video is probably going, what's going on? So I just wanted to just do that. So next week what we're going to do is, while I'm waiting for somebody to write something, next week what we're going to do is we're going to discuss Sabbatai Zvi, the response to that, up into the Baal Shem Tov. And then class 4, we're going to talk about the Baal Shem Tov. Yeah, I will touch a little bit more on Rabbi Akiva and Bar Kokhba, Simon Bar Kokhba, next week. I'm just going to start from where I left off, like I did this week. But we're going to go through that whole process and get all the way up as far as I can. We're going to fly through false messiahs, Simon Bar Kokhba being the first, and then we'll go down the list. But ultimately, my purpose here is to lay out for you, the general you, the concept. I'm speechless. I'm just reading this. Thank you. I appreciate that. Just want to tell the folks, somebody was asking me, thanking me for addressing all the questions about Hanukkah. One of the biggest problems that we have with Hanukkah, as a Jew, as an Orthodox Jew, as a modern Orthodox Jew, most people just, and this is understandable, you know, we've been doing this forever, let's not open up a can of worms. But the truth of the matter is that until you address why we do certain things, honestly, then we can honestly approach why we do what we do and see if it's worthy of us continuing to practice those things. I want to also reiterate that, you know, I always tell people I'm a rabbinical, I'm a scholar first, a historian second, and a rabbi third. And the reason is because if I start with rabbi, then I have to filter these other two away from you. And that's dishonest. And I believe, honestly, completely, because history has proved it out, that if you approach somebody honestly, and instead of telling them because the rabbi's done this forever and this is the reason why we do it, and you discover that that's not true, then you're not going to believe anything that anybody says. And you're going to leave your observance instead of owning it. Because your observance or your practice is based on somebody else's, you're trusting somebody else's idea instead of owning it for yourself. And that's the best and honest way for someone to approach anything that is this deep and important as one's belief system. I don't like using the word faith because we just went through this whole discussion about faith. Faith is something that somebody just, it's like this, it's like the iPhone cloud. It's up there, I don't know what it does, but it's holding all my stuff in the air, you know. And that's really what faith is in the modern sense. Versus immuna, which is merit, which means based on what I've discovered for myself, I trust that what I'm doing is correct, you know. And that's a completely different idea. Dualism is a problem. Thank you, by the way, for all these really great statements and questions. Dualism is a really big problem because, first of all, people always come and this goes for everybody, but I use Christianity as an example because a lot of people come from different perspectives. People hold on to their Bibles and say, this was handed to me and it was in its completeness right from the get-go, and it's not. It's gone through a whole host of things. The whole discussion of, somebody once asked a rabbi when I was in yeshiva, why do we, they were practicing for their bar mitzvah, and they said, why do we do the Haftorah? Where did this come from? I don't remember the Torah saying anything. So don't ask questions. This is the way we've done it. We've done it forever. But that's not true because forever would include Moses, and Isaiah wasn't born when Moses was alive. And this is honestly what happens. Although Hanukkah, when people read the Hanukkah story, they kind of like slide through and go, yeah, instead of reading the Torah, we read the Haftorah, as if we both were we were carrying both and we hid one and used the other. The other came about because they wanted to try to teach the Torah without teaching the Torah. That's a fair question. Somebody just asked, it seems that the concept of dualism allows for a form of escapism, to take off responsibility. But ultimately, if you've ever studied philosophy, and yes, I have a certificate, I have a bachelor's degree, and I did in philosophy. When you read Greek dualistic ideas such as Plato and Aristotle and so forth, the concept is, the gods, and I'm using that term in quotes here, the gods are up here with the universals, and we are people, and we're not. It's like, this is the reason why in Greek thought, art was considered foolish, because painting somebody is making them farther away from the universal. So you're already in a decayed state. You want to aim up, not down towards painting. So many people considered art a very low thing. Let me just reading some more of these here. I may have to miss it, but I'll touch. No worries, Jono. Will definitely ask me questions, and you can always listen to the recording. Joined late, but I wanted to ask if there was a Jesus or a totally fabrication. Amadis Joseph. I kind of touched on that. I said, I don't want to have this. I avoided the discussion. For the most part, as a historian, the argument is that Jesus as being a physical being is hard to point out in history. Yet, if we look at the Mishnah and the Torah, there's a number of examples of people who lived in Galilee and made miracles and walked on water and raised people from the dead. that may be a conglomerate of a number of people, but for this argument, because that's not the point of this talk. The point of this talk is seeing how our idea of Messiah has changed from a bottle of olive oil to what we're talking about today. And of course, next week we'll see how Judaism has kind of gone back and forth between the more spiritual aspects versus going back to a more, for lack of a better term, more traditionalist idea of sticking with jurisprudence in the discussion of the Torah. The great thing is, and I just want to finish this by saying, Judaism at least has been, for the most part, is sort of honest in regard to the approach of where we get the concept of Messiah. We kind of wave back and forth between those versus Christianity and, of course, Islam later on, but Christianity really is the main driving force towards this messianic figure. The concept of a messianic figure doesn't appear and comes to its fullest fruition just before the destruction of the temple, and definitely inculcates during the Bar Kokhba revolt. I've heard Hebrew roots people say that a lot of the New Testament concepts come from the oral law. Is it really sound like something from Philo? Well, the answer is that some of the concepts, some of the parables that are mentioned in the Christian Gospels are how do I say this? Touch on some of the oral tradition, but for the most part, the language and its purpose, the purpose of the Christian scriptures was to adhere to and appeal to very Western Greek and Roman peoples towards this new movement, which, as I said in the beginning, could you probably started meaning in the 21st century. Yeah, as far as that, Judah Perez, I will touch on that on the fourth class. So don't get ahead of me. But for the most part, as I said before, the purpose of early Christianity its purpose was to appeal towards a moral code, treating people equally under the same idea that everybody's equal, that we're all the same, we're brothers and sisters of the same, creation, which was Adam, and they like the idea that you get a day off, and everybody gets a day off. And that is the appeal of Christianity at its core. We know this because if you read Paul, you read his letters, and it's interesting because most Christians will say, well, that's not necessarily the case. But for the most part, if you have a conversation with any, and I can only speak for evangelical Christians because most Catholics don't do this, but most evangelical Christians that are very, trying to reach out to you, trying to inculcate you into their belief system, they're quoting Paul left and right. They know Paul backwards and forwards. And Paul's position is always a Hellenistic kind of, Judaism light kind of yoga practice belief system. So, just looking through everything else. Does anybody have any other further questions? Just to clarify, we got from the bottle of oil to the human Messiah with an example of the Maccabean leadership. Yes, as an example. Because what happens is we see you have to understand, it's a great question. So, what we have is the story of a Hanukkah story where you have a chief priest who rises up against the Greek idealism and routs the Greeks, and then becomes both the leader, the high priest, and the leader of the Jewish people. Not necessarily a king, but that idea of both king and priest happens as a historical action. Kind of like looking at George Washington and saying, what we need is a general president. Even though we know that, the moment that Washington became president, he stopped being a general. And you see, and then what happens is wait a couple, tell that story enough times over a couple of generations, and then you assume that this king-priest discussion is the absolute perfect option when you're being suppressed by a foreign country pressing its foot on your back. So this is what keeps occurring. Even though with the Bar Kokhba revolt, and I know I'm getting ahead of myself, but with the Bar Kokhba revolt, Rabbi Akiva anoints Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba is not a Cohen. So even amongst the Jews, traditionalist Jews, they know the difference. They know better. But the idea of that king priest becomes part of the mythos and becomes part of that Hellenistic idea that becomes eventually Christianity. I hope that. I apologize. I sometimes go off on a tangent, but anyway. I'm just waiting a few seconds to see if anybody has any further questions. By the way, I just want to say to everyone, thank you so much. Your comments and questions, was the idea adopted by both the Hellenist and the Traditionalist? No. Another excellent question. The Traditionalist held fast to the concept of jurisprudence, and that going back to a self-rule. What they wanted was, they didn't, the Pharisees never wanted to rout the Romans. What they wanted was, they wanted the Romans to act more like King Cyrus. They looked at Isaiah and said, this is what we need. And this is the reason why, by the way, and I'll get into it next week, when Yonatan ben Zakkai goes to Vespasian and says, see, you're the anointed Messiah that Isaiah speaks of in chapter 45, he's trying to convince him to be more like Cyrus. That's what Rabbi Yonatan Zakkai is trying to do. And he fails, actually. He saves himself, he saves the contingent of people, but he ultimately fails because the temple is destroyed. But you see, and then we keep coming back to that example. We're looking for a Messiah, and now 2,000 years later, now we're playing games with Rabbi Schneerson and that sort of thing. And Kabbalism is also, but we'll get into that next week. But I hope everybody really enjoyed this. Next week we're going to kind of go through all the examples of failed messiahs, how they failed, and what the response was to the Jewish communities as a whole after their failure, what they thought about and how they observed it, right up to when we get to the Baal Shem Tov. So, great. Thank you for being here. Next week, 8 o'clock. Hopefully it'll be more like this and less like the video from last week. So, until next time, Shalom, Hak Purim Sameach, and good Shabbos to all those who are observing.